Ivy Bennett had been in Seoul for 11 days when she learned that silence could have a temperature. The 38th floor of Halcyon Tower held that silence the way a held breath holds pressure, and she felt it settle over her shoulders the moment the elevator doors slid open and revealed a hallway of glass offices, all empty, all lit, all waiting for a man who had not yet arrived. She adjusted the collar of her blouse, checked the folder in her arms for the third time, and reminded herself that she had been hired to manage a calendar, not a legend. The legend walked in at 8:15 exactly. He did not announce himself.
He did not need to.
The junior assistants near the reception desk went quiet mid-sentence, the way birds go quiet before weather changes, and Ivy turned to see a man in a black suit so precisely tailored it looked less like clothing and more like a decision. His hair was combed back from a sharp widow's peak, and there was ink visible at his left wrist where his cuff had ridden up half an inch, a detail he corrected with a small, automatic motion before anyone else could notice it. His eyes found her first, out of everyone in that hallway, and held. Miho Seo did not smile. People said he had not smiled in 9 years, not once, not at a wedding, not at a funeral, not at a merger worth more than most countries' annual budgets. Ivy did not know that yet. She only knew that his gaze moved over her employee badge, her folder, her face, in that order, and that something in his expression sharpened, like a blade catching light. "You're new," he said. His English carried the faint precision of a man who had learned it as a weapon rather than a comfort. "Ivy Bennett," she said, and held out her hand because that was what you did, because Atlanta had raised her to offer her hand to power and let power decide what to do with it. "I started Monday. I'm covering executive scheduling for Mr. Park's team until they find a permanent hire." He looked at her hand for a beat too long. Then he shook it. His grip was controlled, deliberate, the kind of touch that told her he had decided exactly how much pressure to use before he ever reached for her. "Miho Seo," he said, though everyone on that floor already knew his name the way people know weather patterns, as fact rather than introduction. "You'll not be temporary." He walked past her into his office and closed the door before she could ask what he meant. Ivy stood in the hallway a moment longer than she needed to, aware that every assistant on that floor was very carefully not looking at her. A woman near the printer, dressed in the kind of understated cream blazer that signaled seniority without needing to announce it, finally broke the silence. "He shook your hand," the woman said, as though reporting a small miracle. "I'm Grace Yoon. I run scheduling for the finance division." "He doesn't shake hands. He doesn't touch things he hasn't already decided to keep." "I think he was just being polite," Ivy said. Grace laughed, short and disbelieving. "Miho Seo has never once in 4 years been polite for its own sake. Whatever he does on purpose. Watch yourself." Ivy carried that warning with her through the rest of the morning, turning it over the way she turned over anything that unsettled her, methodically, until it lost its sharpest edges. She told herself Grace was exaggerating, the way people always exaggerated about men with money and power, filling the silence around them with myth, because the truth was too plain to be interesting. She told herself this even as she found her attention drifting, twice, toward the closed door of his office, and caught herself irritated at her own curiosity. By noon she had learned 3 more things about Miho Seo, simply by listening carefully in the break room, the way she had learned to listen carefully in every job she had ever held, gathering the unofficial version of a workplace alongside the official one. He did not eat lunch with anyone ever. He had personally rewritten the security protocols for the entire building after an incident nobody would name directly. And he had once fired an entire floor of middle management in a single afternoon for a leak that was never publicly explained, a story told with the hushed reverence usually reserved for natural disasters. Ivy filed all 3 facts away, unsure yet whether they frightened her or simply sharpened her curiosity into something more dangerous. By the end of her first week, Ivy had pieced together the outline of the empire she'd wandered into. Halcyon Technologies was the largest private tech conglomerate in Seoul, publicly a manufacturer of semiconductors and surveillance software sold to 3 governments and half the shipping industry in the Pacific. Privately, according to whispers she was never supposed to hear, Halcyon was the legal skin stretched over something older and colder, a network that moved money and obligation through Seoul, Busan, and half of Koreatown, Los Angeles under Miho Seo's grandfather, and now under Miho himself. Nobody said the word mafia out loud in that building. Nobody had to. Ivy learned the rest of it in fragments, the way anyone learns the true shape of a place they have moved into without a map. There was a floor below the executive suites that required a separate keycard she was never issued. There were men in the parking structure who did not wear halcyon badges and did not need to. There was a private elevator that only Miho used, and the one time she stepped toward it by mistake, a security officer she had never seen before appeared at her side within 4 seconds, polite, immovable, and steered her firmly back toward the public bank of elevators without a single word of explanation. She filed that away too, the way she filed everything, in the growing ledger of things about Miho Seo that did not add up to an ordinary employer. Ivy had come to Seoul for a job that paid enough to finally clear her sister's hospital debt back home, a job that was supposed to be 12 months of spreadsheets and calendar management and nothing more complicated than jet lag. She had a master's degree in international business she had not yet used for anything that mattered, and she had told herself, on the flight over, that she was done letting fear make her decisions. She had not expected her new boss's boss to look at her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve completely. The accident that chained them together happened on a Thursday, 9 days into the job, when Mr. Park was hospitalized with what the office called a stomach virus and everyone else called something far more dangerous, given the 2 men in dark coats who had visited his office the day before he disappeared into a private hospital wing. Ivy was told, with no room for negotiation, that she would report directly to Miho Seo until further notice. "You understand confidentiality," he said, on her first morning in his direct employ, not as a question. "I understand it's in my contract," she said. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. Not yet. But close enough that she noticed, and hated that she noticed, and filed the observation away, where she kept things she was not ready to examine. Her first morning reporting directly to him began with a briefing so thorough it took her 20 minutes to realize he had memorized her resume, not skimmed it. He asked about the internship she had done at a shipping logistics firm in Savannah, about the year she had spent tutoring evening business classes to cover her sister's medical copays, about why a woman with an international business degree had taken a temporary secretarial post instead of chasing something with a more impressive title. Because temporary posts pay in cash faster than impressive titles pay in anything, she said, before she could decide whether that was too honest to say out loud to her employer. He studied her for a long moment. "That is the first true answer anyone in this office has given me in months." "Is that a compliment?" "It is data," he said, and there was something almost like warmth buried under the clipped delivery. "I collect it carefully." She left that first briefing with the uneasy sense that she had been more thoroughly seen in 20 minutes by Miho Seo than she had been seen in 2 years by the last man she had dated back home, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that realization, so she did what she always did with things that unsettled her. She put it in a drawer in her mind, closed it, and went back to work. Her second day working directly under him, a courier arrived at his office with a black lacquered box that Miho opened, read, and then closed with a stillness that made the temperature of the room drop several degrees. He did not raise his voice. He simply said 3 words in a tone Ivy had never heard a human being use, and the man who had delivered the box turned the color of old paper and left without being told twice. "You should go home early," Miho said, not looking at her. "I have 4 more hours on the schedule." That was not a suggestion born of politeness, Ivy. It was the first time he had used her first name. He said it like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth, like it belonged to a language he had decided, on the spot, to learn properly. She felt it land somewhere under her ribs and told herself it meant nothing. She did not go home early. She stayed because leaving felt like admitting she'd understood exactly how much danger had just walked through that lacquered box, and admitting that felt like the first step toward running, and Ivy Bennett had promised herself in an airport bathroom in Atlanta that she was done running from things simply because they were frightening. That night, at 9:40, 2 men entered the executive floor without clearance. Ivy heard the elevator chime wrong, a half-second too fast, and looked up from her desk in time to see Miho's head of security go for the weapon at his hip a full breath too late. What happened next took 11 seconds. Ivy would count them later, lying awake, trying to understand how her body had made a decision faster than her mind could form the thought behind it. She grabbed the heavy glass paperweight from Miho's desk, the one shaped like a stylized falcon, and hurled it hard into the face of the nearer intruder as he raised his arm toward the office door. It struck him above the eye. He staggered. It was enough of an opening for Miho, who moved through the following moments with an economy of violence that made her stomach drop for reasons that had nothing to do with fear, disarming the second man with two motions so precise they barely looked like a fight at all. When it was over, when the two men had been dragged away by security that arrived far too late to matter, Miho turned to her with blood on his knuckles and something unreadable behind his eyes. "You should not have done that," he said. "You're welcome," she said, because her hands were shaking too hard to be anything but honest. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you. Nobody in this building has put themselves between me and a threat in 9 years." That was the moment everything changed, though neither of them said so out loud. The building's rumor mill, Ivy discovered over the following days, had already rewritten the story a dozen different ways by the time it reached the lower floors. In one version, she had disarmed both men single-handedly. In another, Miho had thrown himself in front of her to take a bullet meant for her chest. Grace relayed each new iteration with visible delight, cornering Ivy in the break room with her coffee still steaming. "My personal favorite," Grace said, "is the one where you're secretly former Special Forces. Are you secretly former Special Forces?" I threw a paperweight, Grace. "A paperweight that, and I quote, a very reliable source in facilities is now bent." Grace grinned over the rim of her cup. "You dented Miho Seo's grandfather's falcon. Do you understand what that means around here? People have been fired for scuffing his desk." "He hasn't said anything about the desk." "That's because he hasn't looked away from you long enough to notice the desk," Grace said, and left before Ivy could formulate a response that did not betray exactly how much that observation had unsettled her. In the days after the attack on the executive floor, Ivy noticed the small ways the building itself seemed to recalibrate around her. Security nodded to her by name instead of checking her badge. The kitchen staff on the executive level began setting aside the ginger tea she liked without being asked. None of it was dramatic. All of it told her that Miho had said something, quietly, to someone, and that his version of gratitude did not come wrapped in words, but in the architecture of small, deliberate comforts. She found herself staying later even on nights when the workload did not require it, telling herself it was efficiency, telling herself it was nothing to do with the way Miho's office light stayed on until she was ready to leave, as though he was pacing himself against her schedule rather than his own. One evening she found him standing at the window instead of at his desk, tie loosened, watching the traffic crawl along the river far below. "You are staring," he said, without turning. "You're not working," she said. "That seemed worth staring at." "I am thinking about a woman who threw my own paperweight at an armed man without asking whether it was wise," he said. "I find the thought keeps interrupting my other thoughts. Is that a problem?" "I have not decided yet," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile she was beginning to recognize as rare currency, spent on her more often, lately, than on anyone else in the building. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm Ivy had not signed up for and could not seem to walk away from. Miho began keeping her later, not because the work demanded it but because, she suspected, he had started to prefer having her in the room. He explained things to her that he explained to no one else, not fully, not the real versions. He told her, in fragments over weeks, about his older cousin Jinwoo, the one who had been groomed to inherit half the empire alongside him, the one who had sold Miho's location to a rival syndicate 11 years earlier for a debt of loyalty Miho still did not fully understand the size of. Miho had walked into an ambush meant to kill him because he trusted his own blood, and he had watched a woman he loved, a woman named Hannah who worked security for his family and who had thrown herself into the path of a bullet meant for him, die on a warehouse floor in Incheon while he held her and could do nothing. "I do not tell people this," he said, the night he told Ivy, his voice flat in the particular way of a man holding something down by force. "I am telling you because you keep making the mistake of standing where danger points." "Maybe I don't think it's a mistake," Ivy said. He looked at her like she had said something dangerous, which she supposed she had. There was a night, weeks into that slow unraveling, when Miho asked her to accompany him to a dinner with a shipping magnate from Busan, a man whose cooperation Halcyon needed for a contract that had nothing to do, on paper, with anything dangerous at all. Ivy wore the one formal dress she had packed for Seoul on the off chance she would need it, and when Miho saw her waiting in the tower lobby, something crossed his face that he did not bother to hide quickly enough. "You look like you belong in rooms I do not usually let people see," he said, which she was fairly certain was the closest thing to a compliment he knew how to give without sounding as though he were negotiating a contract. "Is that dangerous?" "Extremely," he said, and offered his arm with a formality that made her want to laugh and did not, quite, because something in his eyes told her he meant it. The dinner itself unfolded exactly as she expected, all careful pleasantries and negotiation disguised as conversation, until the shipping magnate, 3 glasses of soju in, made an offhand comment about Miho finally having someone soft to come home to, and watched with open curiosity as Miho's expression did not change at all, which she was beginning to understand was itself a kind of answer. Later, in the car, she asked him why he had not corrected the man. "Because he was not wrong," Miho said, looking out the window instead of at her. "I did not appreciate hearing it stated so plainly by a man I do not trust. That is different from it being untrue." She did not have a response for that. She spent the rest of the ride home turning the sentence over in her mind, the way she turned over everything that unsettled her, and found, for the first time, that she did not want to file it away and close the drawer. There were quieter nights too, nights that had nothing to do with danger at all, and those were the ones that unraveled her more thoroughly than any threat could have. He taught her to play baduk on a board that had belonged to his grandfather, correcting her grip on the stones with 2 fingers against her wrist, patient in a way that contradicted everything the rest of the building believed about him. She teased him once about the way he ate, methodical, one section of his plate at a time, and he told her, with the driest expression she had seen him wear, that a man who left disorder on his plate could not be trusted to keep order anywhere else, and she had laughed so hard she nearly knocked over her tea, and he had watched her laugh like it was a rare bird he had not expected to land so close. "You should do that more," he said. "Play baduk badly?" "Laugh," he said. "It suits this building. It has been missing it." She did not know, then, exactly how literally true that was. She only knew that the more time she spent in the rooms he occupied, the harder it became to remember why she had ever planned to leave Seoul in 12 months and never look back. The two things are not related, and also they are entirely related, and I am aware of the contradiction. It was, she would think later, the closest he had come yet to admitting something he was not ready to say directly, and she let it sit between them without pressing because some truths she had learned working for him arrived faster when you did not chase them. The rival faction, the Beck Syndicate out of Busan, escalated their campaign against Halcyon through the following weeks in ways that were never subtle to Ivy again once she understood what she was watching. A shipment vanished. A junior executive was found beaten outside a noribang near Gangnam. A message arrived, taped to the inside of Ivy's own apartment door though the lock had not been forced. 3 words in English clearly meant for her, and not for Miho at all. "We see you." She did not tell him at first. She told herself it was because she did not want to be the reason his focus slipped, but the truth, when she finally admitted it to herself at 2 in the morning with the lights on in every room of her apartment, was that some small stubborn part of her did not want to become one more person he felt responsible for losing. He found out anyway. Of course he found out. Miho Seo did not miss things, and the moment he saw the shift in her posture, the new habit she had developed of checking the street before crossing it, he closed his office door, sat across from her instead of behind his desk, which she had never seen him do, and said, "Tell me." She told him. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she counted her own heartbeat twice. When he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual precision. It had gone somewhere raw. "You will move into the residence tower," he said. "Tonight." "That's not a request either, is it?" "No," he said. "It is the only version of this conversation where you stay alive." She should have argued. She had every reason to argue. A decade of self-sufficiency and a healthy suspicion of powerful men who gave orders instead of asking questions. Instead, she found herself watching his hands, still faintly scarred across the knuckles from the fight weeks earlier, and thinking about how carefully he had said her name that first morning, like it mattered, like it was worth getting right. Okay, she said. Something crossed his face that she would spend a long time trying to name. Relief, maybe. Or fear disguised as relief, which she was beginning to understand was the only kind of fear a man like Miho allowed himself to show. The residence tower was quieter than the office, all soft lighting and marble corridors, staffed by people who greeted her by name within a day and asked no questions about why the head of Halcyon Technologies had personally approved her security clearance for the top 3 floors. She spent her first night there sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, staring at a city skyline that did not belong to her, wondering when exactly her life had stopped being her own to plan. It was there, 3 nights after she moved in, that the tension between them finally broke its careful containment. She had gone up to the rooftop garden, unable to sleep, and found him already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, staring out at a city that glittered like it did not know it was full of knives. "You should be resting," he said, without turning. "So should you." He turned then, and something in his face had come undone in a way she had not seen before, not guarded, not calculated, simply open. "I have spent 9 years making sure nothing could reach me," he said. "No wife. No children. No weakness anyone could use as leverage. It was a discipline. I was very good at it." "Was," Ivy repeated. "You are the first person in years who made me feel like I still had something in me worth protecting instead of only something worth using," he said. "I told myself keeping you close was strategy. I have been lying to myself since the moment you threw that paperweight." She stepped closer, because staying still had stopped being possible. "I didn't come to Seoul to fall for a man who runs half the underworld on this side of the Pacific," she said. "I came here to pay off a hospital bill and go home in a year. And now I keep finding reasons to stay that have nothing to do with a paycheck." He reached up and touched her jaw with a care that felt disproportionate to a man capable of the violence she had watched him deliver weeks earlier, and when he kissed her it was slow and certain, the kind of certainty that told her he had already decided this before either of them said it aloud, and had simply been waiting for her to catch up. She kissed him back and did not let herself think about the men who had left a note on her door. Not yet. Not for one long, unguarded minute that felt like the only honest thing either of them had done in weeks. In the days between that rooftop kiss and the attack that followed, Ivy allowed herself, briefly, to believe the danger might have passed. Grace Yoon noticed the change in her almost immediately, catching her smiling at her phone over lunch in the executive kitchen. "You're glowing," Grace said. "It's disgusting. Also terrifying, given who's responsible for it." "I don't know what you're talking about," Ivy said, failing badly to hide her smile. "Uh-huh," Grace said. "Just be careful. Men like him don't fall halfway. When they fall, the whole building feels it. Good and bad." Ivy thought about that warning more than once in the days that followed, turning it over the way she had turned over Grace's first warning weeks earlier, except this time she found she did not want to guard herself against the thing Grace was describing. She wanted it. She let herself want it, fully, for the first time since she had landed in Seoul with a suitcase and a plan to stay uninvolved. A rival lieutenant named Sung-woo Baek requested a meeting with Miho that same week, ostensibly to discuss a shared shipping contract, and Ivy sat in on the meeting only because Miho asked her to, a decision she understood, watching Sung-woo's eyes flick to her twice during the negotiation, as a deliberate show of trust rather than an oversight. Sung-woo was younger than she expected, sharp-featured, with the kind of easy smile that told her he had learned charm as a survival skill rather than a personality trait. "Your assistant," Sung-woo said afterward, not quite looking at Ivy, "is new." "She is not my assistant," Miho said, in a tone that closed the subject entirely. Sung-woo's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes recalculated, and Ivy felt the shift in the room the way she had learned to feel every shift in that building lately. A small drop in temperature that meant danger had just quietly noted something it intended to use. "You should not have corrected him," she said, once Sung-woo had left. "I do not regret it," Miho said. "But you are right that he will remember it. He was right to worry." The Beck Syndicate's move came 4 days later, and it did not come for Miho. It came for her. She was taken from the underground garage of the residence tower in the space of 90 seconds, a professional operation, 3 men and a van, and a cloth pressed over her mouth that smelled of something clinical and sharp. She woke in a shipping container on the Incheon waterfront with her wrists bound in front of her rather than behind, a mistake she recognized instantly as exactly that, a mistake, because the men holding her had assumed a secretary would not know what to do with unbound hands. They had underestimated the wrong woman. Ivy had spent 3 summers in college working night shifts at a self-defense studio to cover rent, an unglamorous fact she had never once mentioned in the polished world of Halcyon Tower. She waited until the younger of her 2 guards leaned in to check the zip tie at her wrists, then drove her forehead into the bridge of his nose hard enough to drop him, wrenched the tie loose against its stress point the way she had been taught, and was 3 steps toward the container door with his dropped knife in her hand before the second guard fully processed what was happening. The container smelled of salt and rust and diesel, and somewhere beyond the metal walls she could hear the low mechanical groan of a crane working a nearby dock, ordinary sounds that made the extraordinary danger of her situation feel almost obscene in its mundanity. Her pulse hammered in her throat, but her hands, when she flexed them against the loosened tie, were steadier than she expected. She thought, absurdly, of her old self-defense instructor telling her that fear was only useful if you let it sharpen you instead of freeze you. She did not wait for rescue. She did not have time to. She used the dark, the disorientation, and the element of a woman who was supposedly helpless, and when Miho's security team breached the warehouse 11 minutes later, following the tracker she had not known was sewn into the lining of her coat, they found her already free, already armed, standing over the second guard with the kind of stillness that made 2 of Miho's own soldiers hesitate at the door. Miho arrived behind them, and the look on his face when he saw her standing upright, breathing hard but unbroken, was not relief exactly. It was something closer to recognition, as though he was seeing, finally and completely, the shape of the woman he had already decided to love. "I told you," she said, voice shaking with adrenaline rather than fear. "I don't need saving." "No," he said, closing the distance between them and pulling her against him with a force that told her exactly how frightened he had actually been. "You needed a war ended. That is different." In the hours immediately after the warehouse, Miho did not leave her side, though he said very little, sitting beside her in the back of an armored car with her hand held so tightly in his that she could feel his pulse still racing against her fingers long after her own had begun to slow. Grace arrived at the residence tower before dawn with a change of clothes and no questions, simply wrapping Ivy in a hug that told her more about how frightened the entire building had been than any words could have. "You scared everyone half to death," Grace whispered. "Including him. Especially him." Ivy slept for 11 hours after that, and when she woke, Miho was in the chair beside the bed, still in the same shirt from the night before, watching her with an intensity that told her he had not slept at all. "You didn't have to stay," she said, voice rough with sleep. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." She studied him for a long moment, taking in the exhaustion carved into his face, the way his usual precision had frayed at the edges. "Tell me what happened after they found me," she said. Ivy did not witness the final confrontation directly, but she stood beside him in the boardroom on the 38th floor when representatives of 3 rival organizations sat across the table and watched Miho Seo lay out, with total composure, exactly what would happen to anyone who came near her again, and exactly what evidence he now possessed against every man in that room who had orchestrated her abduction. He did not raise his voice once. He did not need to. By the time the meeting ended, the Beck Syndicate's leadership in Busan had been quietly, permanently restructured, and the note taped to Ivy's door became the last message anyone from that organization ever sent her. Sungwoo Beck was not among the men who walked out of that boardroom under their own power, and Ivy noticed, without asking for details she did not particularly want, that no one in the building mentioned his name again after that afternoon. She did not ask Miho what had happened to him. Some silences, she was learning, were kindnesses she gave herself rather than concessions she made to danger. Afterward, in the empty boardroom, Miho finally let his shoulders drop the way she had never once seen them drop in the 2 months she had known him. "There's a cost to all of this," she said, watching him. "There always is." "What did it cost you?" "9 years of certainty that I did not need anyone," he said. "I find I am not sorry to lose it." She laughed, and something in the sound seemed to surprise him, seemed to catch him off guard the way nothing in that building had caught him off guard in years, and for the first time since Ivy Bennett had walked out of that elevator on her first day, Miho Seo smiled. It was small. It was almost involuntary. It transformed his entire face into something she suspected very few people alive had ever been permitted to see. "They said you hadn't laughed in 9 years, she said quietly. "I hadn't had a reason to," he said, and reached for her hand, not with the controlled precision he had used the day they met, but simply, like a man reaching for something he intended to keep. In the weeks that followed, Halcyon Tower settled into a version of normal that Ivy suspected the building had not known in a very long time. Grace started leaving the office at a reasonable hour again, no longer bracing for the next crisis to break across the executive floor. The junior assistants stopped going quiet when Miho walked past, replacing that old brittle silence with something closer to simple respect. Ivy noticed these changes the way she noticed everything, methodically, and understood that she was watching an entire ecosystem exhale. She did not move back to her old apartment. She told herself, at first, that it was a matter of security, that the residence tower simply made more sense given everything that had happened, but she stopped bothering with that explanation once Miho began leaving a second key on the table by the door without either of them discussing it directly. Some agreements did not need to be spoken to be real. She called her sister in Atlanta on a Sunday evening, the two of them talking for almost an hour about nothing in particular, and when her sister finally asked, with the bluntness only siblings were allowed, whether the man Ivy kept carefully not mentioning by name was the reason she sounded different lately, lighter somehow, Ivy found she did not have it in her to deny it. "He's complicated," Ivy admitted. "Complicated like emotionally unavailable, or complicated like international crime syndicate?" her sister asked, only half joking. "Let's just say he owns a very large tech company," Ivy said, and let the rest of it sit unspoken, the way she had learned to let certain truths sit unspoken in soul, present and understood without needing to be named aloud. Miho, for his part, began doing something she had never seen him do in the months she had worked for him. He delegated. Not everything, not the parts of the empire only he could carry, but enough that he was in the residence tower most evenings before the sky had fully gone dark, enough that Grace started joking, not entirely without evidence, that Ivy Bennett had single-handedly reduced Miho Seo's average office hours by 30%, which Grace considered, loudly and often, a public service to the entire building. One evening, months after the warehouse, after the Beck Syndicate had become a cautionary story other organizations told each other rather than an active threat, Miho found her again on the rooftop garden, in the same spot where everything between them had first come undone. "You keep coming back here," she said. "It reminds me of the night I stopped pretending," he said. "I find I like the reminder." He did not propose that night. He did not make any grand declaration, and Ivy would come to understand, over the months that followed, that this was simply who he was, a man who showed devotion through consistency rather than spectacle, through the key left on the table, through the ginger tea that still appeared without her asking, through the way he still, every single time, said her name like it was the only word in any language worth getting exactly right. Ivy did not go home in a year. She built a life in Seoul she had not planned for and would not have traded for the one she left behind, standing beside a man the city called dangerous and coming to understand that danger and devotion could share the same hands, the same quiet voice, the same careful precision. She never stopped being the woman who threw a paperweight at an armed intruder without stopping to think about the consequences, and Miho, for his part, never stopped looking at her like that single reckless act had been the moment his entire guarded life quietly, irreversibly cracked open. Grace liked to say, whenever the subject came up over lunch, that the entire 38th floor owed Ivy Bennett a debt it could never repay, since morale had improved so dramatically since Miho Seo learned how to leave the building before 9 at night. Ivy always waved the comment off, But privately she treasured it, treasured the ordinary rhythm that had grown up around the extraordinary danger of how they had met, treasured the small daily proof that a life built on choice rather than fear could still hold room for tenderness. She thought, sometimes, about the version of herself who had stepped off the plane 11 months earlier with a single suitcase and a plan to stay uninvolved, and she found she did not miss that woman's caution so much as she respected the fear it had come from. That woman had been trying to protect herself the only way she knew how. This version of her had simply learned a different kind of protection, one built on choosing to stay even when staying meant risk, one built on a man who said her name like it mattered every single time he said it. What remained between them was not a fairy tale ending, not a wedding, not a declaration shouted into the soul skyline, but something steadier and more honest than that, a choice they kept making, quietly, every single day, to stay. If this story pulled you in, make sure you like this video, subscribe for more, and drop a comment below telling us which moment hit you the hardest. We've got so many more stories like this one coming, so stick around.